Welcome back. We are looking really at sociocultural issues in comparative and international education, but in this string of screencasts, we've been looking at how culture and multicultural education in particular can help us understand the more structural and content side of education rather than only looking at external factors where society and culture are sort of contextual elements rather than embedded in the content. And we've been through a little bit of a journey looking at definitions of multicultural education and different ways of defining culture itself using some theoretical frameworks as a foundation. And we found ourselves arriving at critical pedagogy and the idea that stratification within society and inequality in terms of power relationships will almost always be embedded in the ways that we think about sociocultural issues in education. And one way to really help us understand those sociocultural issues and understand how culture and society are embedded in the content of education is to use a critical pedagogy approach such as the one offered by Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So that's sort of the long way around to talk about how we got here. So if you do a Google search, you can find other screencasts where I've talked more exclusively about pedagogy of the oppressed in terms of equality and globalization. But I want to talk about this topic of pedagogy of the oppressed and critical pedagogy, specifically in terms of multicultural education and sociocultural issues related to comparative and international education. Now, from a critical pedagogy perspective, Freire's idea was that we can use education to teach people to understand the political and economic forces that influence the structure of society in order to prepare them to work for social change. This very much reflects many of those later definitions of multicultural education that Wren was pointing out in his book, Conceptions of Culture. This idea that we can make an active stand and take an active approach through education to creating an understanding of, specifically talking about political and economic forces, but also social and cultural forces. And he says that, or he argues that critical pedagogy uses a problem-posing approach as a way to link education to the lives of the students. And the same could be said for looking at education through a multicultural lens. It's a problem-solving approach. How do we solve the problems of inequality in terms of race or ethnicity? How do we solve the problems of ethnocentrism? Right? Those are real issues and real problems that multicultural education attempts to address. And that through multicultural education, we can also create a sense or an awareness of our own identity, our own ethnicity, and then think about the consequences of our own identity and how it interacts with or how it causes us or leads us to behave certain ways around others who may share that identity or not, may come from a different culture as well. And to work through education to create this awareness of the stratification that was existing and one's own social and cultural identity and how that was and was not creating opportunities for creating a better society and more equality, Freire came up with 5 stages in dialogue. And I'm not going to go through these in a whole lot of depth. But I do want to talk about, or at least highlight, that there's a problem-posing approach, that there's an observational approach, that there's a reflection that occurs, that there is an awareness that results, and that there is a sort of an actionable item, that there's this controlling influence that's ejected from the minds of the oppressor. Although we take Freire seriously, the oppressor needs to really go away in order for there to be a better state. Now, when we talk about embedding society and culture in education and the ways that education can address the problems around race, culture, and identity, Freire's idea of humanization, I think, is really important, and it's the idea that freedom is an essential aspect of humanity, and that any kinds of oppression through education itself or as a consequence of society and culture and how that embeds itself or contextualizes education, any of that kind of oppression will involve dehumanization or this constraining of freedom. And that affects everyone involved. So the oppressor as well as the oppressed, they're just as dehumanized by the whole process. And so if we are creating a multicultural educational system that is aware of and embedded with social and cultural differences and identities, and using that as a way to create equal opportunities and equal approaches to the content and to the structure of education, then really we're creating a freedom for both the oppressed and the oppressor. And he says that there are some characteristics we can see of the oppressed which will help us to identify when there is this sort of situation at hand. And I'm not going to dwell on these too long, but I do want to point them out. One is that the oppressed will internalize the oppressor. In other words, they will come to align their identities more with the oppressor than with their own or their home or their indigenous ethnicity or cultural group or affinity group or whatever you want to use to identify that initial ethnicity or cultural group. And that the oppressed then will suffer from something that he calls duality. Meaning that they will, that's supposed to circle duality, not cross through it, that they will be fearful of freedom, that they will become unauthentic beings because they're trying to be reflections of their oppressors while never really being able to do that because they are, in fact, the oppressed. So when society and culture tend to bias education, or let's use an example in the United States, for example, a great majority of the teacher workforce is white. It comes from a white culture and racial and ethnic background. It is predominantly middle class. So from an economic or socioeconomic point of view, most teachers are middle class, and most teachers are female. So there's a gender bias. So white, middle class females would describe most of the teacher workforce in the United States. And if those teachers are embedding their own ethnic, cultural, gender, and socioeconomic identities and understandings and knowledge into the curriculum and the ways that they're teaching the curriculum with their students, especially if their students do not share their same race, class, or gender, then the students end up with this duality. They are internalizing the race, culture, and identity of their teachers. So they are identifying with them because that is what their whole context is made up of. But they're not ever able to become that. You have a male African-American, millionaire is not going to be able to become magically a white middle-class female. And so there will be this duality, although I'm not sure how a millionaire can be oppressed, but you get where I'm going with this duality, I hope. And Freire points out that as a result of this situation, there are many myths of the oppressors that we could be aware of. And this is page 135 in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, not in our Conceptions of Culture book. And he points out 13 myths of the oppressor, which again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but these can also help us understand how sociocultural issues can affect education both as contextual factors outside of school, as well as structural and content factors within the education system itself. One of the most well-known concepts from Freire is the banking concept. And the banking concept basically says that students are passive receptors of deposits that are, I did air quotes when I was saying that just now, although you can't see me do that. Students are passive receptors of deposits prescribed and delivered by the instructor. And he specifically says that knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. Now remember, he's not advocating for this. He's not saying that this is the way that it should be or the right way. Freire is pointing out that this is the way that the oppressors operate when they're in charge of education. And he says that then this mirrors an oppressive society because the teacher teaches and the students are taught, the teacher knows everything, the students know nothing, etc., etc. But remember that the key to all of this is that the oppressors, in this case the teachers would represent the oppressors, are the oppressors because they are from the dominant, or at least the most powerful social and cultural groups within their particular community or society or education system. So it's actually a really good example of the way that socio-cultural issues can influence education, and one that I think was well represented by the podcast that from This American Life that dealt with integration, racial integration in schools, and the way that that was being approached and some of the problems involved with that. Now, Freire also points out that education is a way to overcome this duality, and it requires both subjective and objective elements, but mostly it requires dialogue between educators and students, and it has to be something that is more than just elitists telling the oppressed what they need to be doing. Right? So this dialogue is a very important element. And if we get the oppressed and the educators involved in dialogue, then this becomes a process of liberation because it stretches across social and cultural boundaries. It does exactly what those definitions, those latter definitions of multicultural education are geared toward, and it creates opportunities for equality. It creates linkages across different societies and cultures. It creates awareness both of one's own identity and the way that one's own identity can create ethnocentrism. So it's a very strong approach for that. I'm going to skip over that. So this brings us to a key question, or a couple of key questions. What are sociocultural issues in comparative and international education? If you're listening to this screencast or watching the screencast as a part of the course called Sociocultural Issues in Comparative and International Education, you have just completed a couple of midterm essays that dealt with and explicitly asked you to define sociocultural issues in comparative and international education. And what you may have found is that those issues, what they are, change depending on the particular context or the particular education system that you're dealing with. So answering the question, what are sociocultural issues, really has a lot to do with identifying what are the societies and cultures that are at play in any given education system. And then we can ask questions about how does Ren's conceptions of culture help, and how does Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed help us understand sociocultural issues in CIE, and the ways that you're thinking about applying those ideas to these real-world examples, especially related to race, culture, and identity, like you saw in the podcast. So this is something that I would like for you to talk about, if you're in sociocultural issues in comparative and international education right now. I'd like for you to talk about this on this week's discussion board. What applications, combining Ren's conceptions of culture and Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, are there to comparative and international education for these sociocultural issues? How do you take these two things and create some understanding in comparative and international education contexts? Give some ideas for that. Just talk through it. If you want to be more theoretical, great, be more theoretical. If you want to be more application or example oriented, great, be more example or application oriented. Either way, I hope that this was a start in taking this discussion forward. This means forward. It's an arrow pointing to the future. And I look forward to reading your comments on the discussion board. Thanks a lot.